go ahead and get going. I know we'll have others that will be joining us, but before we jump into our presentation and our content for the day today, I do want to do a brief welcome and walk through some housekeeping notes. So first, for housekeeping, one, I want to let you all know that the webinar today is being recorded and will be made available to those of you that have registered for the series. If you're uncomfortable with it being recorded, then now's your chance to step off of the line. Also want to strongly encourage folks to make sure that you are connected to the audio system in some way. While we do have everyone's lines muted at this time, besides our presenters, there will be opportunities for questions and answers and comments. While we certainly encourage you to utilize the chat box throughout the webinar today, if there's opportunity, you can also speak over the audio line. If you would like to do that and you're joining us by phone, you will need to have entered your audio PIN. And you can find that unique audio PIN under the Go-To Training Control panel. Under audio, make sure you've selected phone call. You'll see that there is a unique number to you. You'll press the pound key on your telephone, enter the number, and pound again, and that will connect you to our audio system. If you're joining us by microphone on your computer, you should be already connected. And under the control panel, you'll be able to unmute your line if I've unmuted you. So if you would like to speak over the audio line, you can use the raise your hand feature, and that will indicate to me that you would like your line unmuted, and I will let you know when that's the case on my end. So again, encourage you to utilize the chat box with any questions or comments throughout the call today. And when available, encourage you to speak over the audio line as well, as it's always great to hear your voices. So with that, I just wanted to say hello myself. I'm Rachel Bruns. I'm the Deputy Director for America's Service Commissions, also known as ASC. We are the National Association for the 52 state service commissions and their programs. State service commissions currently administer more than 80% of all AmeriCorps state and national funding and really lead service and volunteerism initiatives in their states. So as the association, this series is one opportunity that is available to state service commissions. So for those of you that are on the call today, your state service commission opted into this offering that is focused on really looking at how to build a more inclusive national service programming. So today and the subsequent webinars connected with this series are available to you thanks to your state service commission opting into this series. America's Service Commissions is pleased to be partnering with Public Allies, who is presenting the content for this series. I'm going to go ahead and just hand it off to Aaron Guest and Ava Hernandez, who will be our presenters for the series. So Aaron and Ava.
Hello, welcome.
Hi, everyone. This is Erin Guest, and I'm the National Administrator of Program Operations for Public Allies National Office, and I'm here with my colleague, Ava.
Hi, y'all. I am the Executive Director of Public Allies New Orleans. We are one of the 25 sites under the Public Allies National umbrella.
Okay. And I think speaking for me, for Ava, also we're really honored and excited to be here today. We're really grateful for the opportunity to do this work with all of you. And I think want to start by thanking Rachel for her partnership, for her genuine partnership in this work, and for ASC's commitment to equity. So we want to start by letting you all say hello in the chat. And so just to get a sense of who's in the room, if you all could just put one sentence in the chat box. Where are you located, your city and state? What program are you representing? And most importantly, why are you here? So an example would be New Orleans, Public Allies, improve practices of inclusion in our member host sites. So we're just going to take a minute give you all a chance to enter into the chat where you're from, the organization you're with, and why you're here today. Okay, so we have Elizabeth from Morgantown, Selena from Montana Conservation Corps. Don't forget to say why you're here. Great. All right. Improving ability to recruit and support a member corps. Expand inclusion practices. These are coming at me fast, so I'm reading them off. Awesome. All right, someone from Kansas. Very cool. Okay, and someone who's brand new, been in their position for 3 weeks. Awesome. So feel free to keep doing that so we get a sense of who is in the room and why. All right. So we wanted to start by doing a body check-in. One of the things that has been coming up for Ava and I as we've been doing this work is that doing work around inclusion and equity virtually can be challenging. And like, let me take a step back. Doing virtual work in general is very challenging. It would be much nicer if we were all in a room together and could physically be in space. And so because we're not, we're just gonna take a moment to check in. And so part of this, I think, is sort of mentally giving ourselves the space to do this work. I know that when my work is really busy and things are coming at me, taking 90 minutes to get in a session like this can seem like time I don't have. And so I think we're wanting to take a minute to just kind of create that space and check in with what your body's doing. Are you feeling excited or open? Can you already feel a part of your body maybe saying, I already know this stuff? So just wanting to kind of start here, because I think fundamentally this work is about bodies, right? It's about our bodies and about whose bodies matter and who bodies don't, and which bodies don't. And I think as part of socialization, we've been taught to disconnect from that. And so just by starting here, starting with our bodies, is a good place to start. And so one of the questions I have for you is, do you need a drink of water? Do you have a pen or pencil? If you need it to take notes, do you have the things that you need to make the session really useful for you? Okay.
Awesome. So we titled this series, Nothing About Us Without Us is For Us. And this is a phrase that actually I first came across being a native to New Orleanian. I came across it right after Hurricane Katrina when the community was decimated by floods. You had 80% of the city underwater, and you had a lot of people who were being displaced and a lot of efforts to come in and support a quote unquote rebuilding of New Orleans. And so this, I first raised from a poster that was talking about housing and who's going to be able to come back and who's not, and who are they rebuilding the city for. But investigating a little bit more, it came out of the disability rights movement. It also was used in movements within South Africa for liberation and anti-apartheid stuff. And so basically it's this idea that is exactly what it says. Nothing about us without us is for us. So this is really at the heart of this phrase is about inclusion. It's about justice. It's about equity. It's about being able to determine the course of your lives and being able to determine the opportunities that we have, and that people who are often most impacted by injustice and equity are often not at the table when it comes to decision making. They're not at the table when it comes to determining the policies, determining the funding, determining the approaches, the interventions, all of that. And the nonprofit sector and the work that we do really rests in the heart of challenging us to really grow in how inclusive we are, and how we are really challenging ourselves to share power, to reframe what we think, how we think about power, how we think about our practices. And really this 3-part series, this is the first part of it, is really about centering our own personal understanding, our own and our own personal power and role in looking at injustice, looking at equity, looking at oppression, and moving us towards a liberation framework.
Okay, and Public Allies is committed to, as Ava said, putting those at the table who sit at the center of the injustices within our country. So just a quick overview of Public Allies. Our mission is to build a more just and equitable society and the diverse leadership to sustain it. We've been an AmeriCorps program since 1992. Actually, we were a demonstration program to make the case that AmeriCorps should be formed. And since then, we've advanced 8,000 diverse young adults in 25 cities. And that's just working with our AmeriCorps 10-month apprenticeship. And so just wanted to give you some quick stats about Public Allies. So thinking about our last AmeriCorps program year, our 18-19 program year, we enrolled 594 members with 453 partners. Of all of our members last year, 79% identified as people of color and 20% identified as LGBTQIA, 4% identified as transgender, and 62% were from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. And again, that was in our last program year. Now Ava's going to talk a little bit about our leadership model.
So Public Allies, we are grounded by 6 core values: diversity, inclusion, integrity, focus on assets, collaboration, continuous learning, and innovation. These values really take shape when we work with them in terms of our leadership actions. So we have 10+1 leadership actions. And the first one that really is, I think, critical to the work that we do here at Public Allies, both internally as an organization and the way we also support our core members and our host sites, and the way we see ourselves in connection with the communities that we're in, is the first one, which is recognizing and articulating how systemic oppression affects all levels of society. So if we're thinking about this first leadership action, it's really understanding that the work that we do exists because there is inequity, exists because there is injustice. And so really our work needs to be constantly driving towards getting towards the root causes of why there is the quote unquote need that we see in our communities, and that our program aims to support in dismantling. And so a lot of the work that we do is really around understanding how systemic oppression affects us organizationally, how it affects our core members, how it affects our communities, and really also starting with ourselves. What, in terms of our own leadership, how are we rooting ourselves in liberation work and continuing to challenge ourselves to grow in that? Because it is thinking about our leadership action number 8, which is on the screen, which is, it really is a continuous journey. It's a lifelong commitment. It's one that is always rooted in growth, and it's a journey that's never done. So Erin, you want to go to overview?
Yeah, so today we're just going to scratch the surface here. We're going to begin the conversation. So we're going to cover a couple things. We're going to look at what the levels of oppression are, and spend some time looking at an anti-oppression framework. Then we'll look at the differences between equality and equity and liberation. We'll spend some time with the cycle of socialization and the iceberg, and then move to the cycle of liberation and identify some next steps.
So thinking back really to what I just said a couple seconds ago about this, our first leadership action, which is recognizing and articulating how systemic oppression affects all levels of society, that is foundational to doing work that is around inclusion and liberation.
And this is really hard, right? Like, I think that sometimes I wish that a miracle would occur. We would elect the right person, something, humankind would just wake up out of this terrible dream and realize that equity is the way to go and everyone's going to be happy, right? But in lieu of that, until that happens, we are going to dig into the work in front of us. And so I just wanted to leave this little section about public allies with this quote, because this is something that staff members here come back to often in our own work. If you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And so this quote, I think, can help to ground us in the work that we're doing, the work that Ava and I do together at Public Allies, the work we do with our core members, the work we do in partnership with all of you on the phone, right? The work we do with ASC. This is about us working together because our liberation is bound up together. Okay.
So beginning with an anti-oppression framework is really looking at how oppression is maintained, the different levels of how it shows up. And so it shows up in three main ways, which is an individual level. So this is really how oppression is perpetuated through our attitudes and behaviors of us as individuals, as people. It can be both conscious and unconscious attitudes and behaviors. Another way it shows up is institutionally. So this is when we think about the institutions in our society, from family to government to business and industry, education, the legal system, religious organizations. Oppression is often codified in laws, policies, practices, and norms. I think our work within a federal program like AmeriCorps, that's a very, I think, fertile ground to look at what how oppression shows up in our work, in our policies and in our practices. And then the last thing that kind of undergirds all of this is the societal and cultural level. So oppression is maintained ultimately by the norms and patterns that really move forward the values that connect individuals and institutions. So really thinking of the cultural perspectives of dominant groups tends to be what's imposed. Anything from the philosophies of life, definitions of good and evil, beauty standards, ideas of what we consider to be normal, healthy, how we define deviance, sickness, etc. And so we look at oppression operating on multiple levels, both individually, institutionally, and culturally, but then also operates in our attitudes and our behaviors, which is essentially our practices, and then can operate on a subconscious or unconscious and a conscious level. So there are many things that we do that we may not even be aware of as oppressive. Part of the work towards liberation is really that self-reflection piece of seeing what are the practices or the beliefs that we hold that might be exclusionary, whether it's intentional or not. And so we kind of have a framework of some sort of guiding principles or working assumptions that we base all of our anti-oppression work on. And this is the work that we often, the framework in which we also share with our core members, because our core members are also deepening their own practice as change agents through our program. And so these are the beliefs that are kind of the background of the work that we do. So looking at oppression as pervasive, and it hurts us all, though not in the same ways. Confronting oppression will benefit everyone. Adultism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, and every form of oppression is both a system of oppression and a system of advantage, meaning what makes it oppression is that there are people that benefit from these systems, whether or not they realize it or not, and there are people that are oppressed or targeted because of these systems. Also, all prejudice was taught to us. We resisted this teaching. If we choose to, we can unlearn it. And so when we think about all prejudice was taught to us and what it means to resist this teaching, Erin's going to talk about this later on in the cycle of socialization, but thinking of and inviting y'all to think back to what are some of the earliest lessons that you got about difference that you may have gotten from family or from a teacher or from a trusted adult. Most of that happens in our childhood. And we can unlearn these things. And then the other thing is fixing blame helps no one. Taking responsibility helps everyone. I keep thinking, I'm going to date myself with that Billy Joel song, but we didn't start the fire. I don't know if you know that really corny song, but I think about that when I read this value is. This is really not about pointing fingers, but this is really about what's the responsibility that we have in our roles, personally in our roles, in our communities, with our families, with ourselves, and in our roles working in AmeriCorps to help move us towards liberation. Erin, can you go to the next screen? So. The thing is none of us invented oppression. We inherited this legacy, and it's not our fault. We didn't create it, but we have to accept responsibility for its continued existence. And that's a place where we really begin, where it's really critical to begin that. What can we do now? All prejudices and oppressions are interwoven and entangled. So thinking back to the first thing about oppression is pervasive and hurts us, although not in the same way. So oppressions don't just exist in isolation. Race and class and gender, sexual orientation, these sorts of things can impact how people feel, experience oppressions. There's no hierarchy of oppression. So trying to rank one group's pain over another distracts us and prevents us from dismantling any and all oppression. And so also all of us have had the experience of being a target of oppression as well as the experience of privilege. So when we think about the different identities we hold, whether it's around race, class, gender, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, ability, at any one of these any one of those identities, we might be targeted in one identity but advantaged in another. Next slide. So there is no such thing as passive anti-oppression. We are either actively working against oppression or we are colluding with it, allowing it to continue in our name. And I think that speaks to why we're all here, why we have all of y'all signed up to participate in this, is to actually look at what it means to build an inclusive program and a program that really meets the needs and speaks to the power that is resonant in the communities that y'all are located in. Part of this also is that individuals, organizations, and communities can and do grow and change. And that is important to hold, because with oppression, with injustice, with prejudice, with these things that we experience on a personal level and on a systemic level, there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of trauma. But within all of that, we hold to the premise that people, organizations, and communities can and do grow, and change is possible. That this work is about what is possible, even if the road of how we get to what is possible, it feels unclear. We hold that belief that change is possible, that a better world is possible. And then our commitment to eliminating all forms of injustice must be a lifelong one. So our core members aren't going to change the world in 10 months. We're not going to change, everything and solve everything. If that was the case, it would have been done before us, right? But this is a part of a lifelong commitment, and this is also part of the legacy that we're going to be leaving to our future generations. And then also, confronting social injustice is painful. And it is also joyful, and thinking about that joyful is really grounded in that liberation and what it means to build in really deep and intentional ways within our communities.
Okay, so we're going to take a pause here because that was just a lot of information, and we want to give you all a chance to reflect on what Ava just said. So Ava, could you click on the framework document link and post in chat. I'm not sure I can do it from, because I'm sharing screen.
Yeah,
but
let me
what,
pull up.
Okay, awesome. So we're wondering if there's a statement, a phrase, or a word in the framework that Ava just shared that resonates with you. And the resonation could be on a deep aha or yes level, or it could be in a discomfort way. It could be in a, I'm not sure about that way. And so just take a minute if you feel comfortable and you want to share in the chat your statement, phrase, or word. That would be great. It would be good to see what is standing out to all of you. And while Ava's doing that, I'll go backward and show you all the 12 statements again.
I just shared it. Okay, there we go.
Awesome, thank you. And so hopefully you'll be able to click on that link and see all 12 statements together. Okay, so we're getting some statements. So lifelong commitment, system of oppression equals system of advantage. Another one, same thing, system of oppression equals system of advantage. Liberation, all prejudice is taught to us and therefore can be unlearned. There is no hierarchy of oppression. Painful and joyful. Painful and joyful, both painful and joyful. That's great. Does anybody want to speak their word, phrase, or statement? I think if you do, if you want to raise hands, I think, Rachel, that's the best way to do it.
Yes, if you want to speak over the audio line, feel free to raise your hand and I'll unmute your line, or you can send me a quick note in the chat box as well.
I would love to hear one or two people just speak a word or phrase or statement that is meaningful to them. If you feel comfortable or comfortably uncomfortable.
Okay, Janet has her hand up. Janet, I've unmuted your line, but you'll still need to unmute it on your end.
This is Kelsey. I'm with Janet. I think that it's important, the phrase where you guys said about how it changes, that corporations and organizations can change and communities can change, because when dealing with this, I feel a lot of times I get like, I guess just like worn down, you know, and like, this is always going to be this way. It's never going to change. Like, what am I doing? And that's not true. And so that was a nice little like beacon of hope.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think many of us have had the experience of feeling worn out. And Janet is talking about the importance of going back to the statement that there is hope, that people and organizations and companies are able to change. Rachel, do we have any other hands up?
Not yet.
Okay. Ava, do you have any follow-up to the comments in the chat?
You know, thinking about what it means, the reality of getting burnt out or worn down by trying to do this work that is very difficult work, and it's work that is messy, and it is complicated, and it is nuanced, and in some ways it's almost the systems are set up to kind of swallow folks who are trying to change the status quo. One of the things that I received several years ago in doing community work was a poem or a prayer by Archbishop Oscar Romero, and he was the Archbishop in El Salvador, and during the height of the Civil War down there, and he was murdered, I think, giving mass, and he was really working to help provide justice and build power among the people that were in El Salvador, particularly the indigenous communities there. But one of the things that he said in his prayer was that we plant the seeds that will one day grow, and that the things that we might be planting and cultivating may take fruit in a lifetime that's beyond our own. And he cautioned us to think about, we are the work of ministers and not messiahs, and that we can't do everything, but that is liberating because it frees us to do something or one thing and do that thing very well. And that often we're like, one of the things he says, we are prophets of a future that is not our own. And so I hold that sometimes when I'm feeling overwhelmed, because it is very easy to feel overwhelmed and to get overwhelmed, because this is very hard work, and it often feels that the things are stacked against us. In many ways they are, but it's really about taking that moment of self-care and then also reflection to recognize that we are part of a larger movement, and that we have a very important role to play, but that role isn't to stretch ourselves to fix everything, but just to take time for ourselves, and then to also focus in on something, no matter how we see it to be small, to think about that. And that's what I come back to sometimes, because this is difficult work, but it is absolutely the work, right? Is what we call the struggle, right? So I'm just thinking about that in terms of what Kelsey shared. So.
Thanks, Ava.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else want to share? Rachel, do we have any other hands raised, or anyone else want to jump in?
I do not see any other hands at this time.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so moving on, Ava's going to talk a little bit about the difference between equality, equity, and liberation.
So looking at this slide of equality and equity, this is an image that was shared widely. I've seen it used before to explain the difference between equality and equity. So if you look at this image, you have three people, and there is a game, right? There's a game that's happening on the other side of the fence. And equality, how typically equality is framed, is that everybody, no matter who they are, gets the same size box. And for a person that can already see over the fence, that's fine. They can see over the fence anyway. For a person who may not be able to see over the fence, having the same size box doesn't really help, right? And so often then we have the scene on the right, which is how equity is sort of framed, which is equity acknowledges that a person to give resources based on what the need is, right? And so there's still the fence that exists, there's still the game, but we've the person that is shorter gets 2 boxes, and the person that doesn't need to see over the fence, I mean that is able to see over the fence, is still able to. So equity is about looking at the resources that people may need to be able to see over the fence. But what's challenging about this is it we're going to move to the next slide, Erin, is really thinking about what it really looks like. So we have equality, which is giving everybody the same no matter what. We have equity, which is giving resources depending on what people, quote unquote, may need, right? But the reality is, the reality is people are not starting out from a level playing field. So if you look at the equality and equity sort of graph, sort of image, people are not starting people are starting at the same level playing field. The reality is that there are people that are starting below that, and then the reality is that the people are also, resources are also distributed in such inequitable ways in our society that the person that sees over the fence that doesn't need these resources is able to acquire more, right? So this is the reality, that there is inequity in how resources are distributed. But the work of liberation really is about pushing us beyond, not beyond equity, but to push equity further, to actually looking at removing the fence, right? So I like this slide, this graph or this picture, because it shows that the work of liberation is really about removing the fence, as removing the barriers to accessing the game. And it's also shifting the narrative so that the problem isn't about the person who is short. So basically defining the need based on what's inherently wrong with the person, but instead understanding that the problem is that there's a fence and that there's not a level playing field. And so this model of liberation really looks at what do we need to create opportunities for everybody to have the lives, to fulfill the quality of life that they want to have, and looks at removing those barriers and leveling the playing field. And so we really want to push an equity model towards liberation, and as that is our ultimate goal, and reframe the concept of people who are oppressed or who don't have equal resources as it being inherent to who they are, but more really about the systems that are set up to create inequity. Any questions about that or thoughts to that?
And Ava, just wanted to add, I think there's also the concept in the third picture, reality, that the individuals have earned somehow whatever boxes they have, or from that some people are starting out with more height in this case, or resources or boxes because they somehow earned them.
Mm-hmm.
And other people haven't.
And often, I want us to think critically about how does the common language that we might hear in words like service, or some of the dominant thoughts about national service or AmeriCorps, the way it's framed, how might this challenge that, right? Or how might our practices and our work either reaffirm an equality thing or are moving us towards liberation. And so looking at the work of nonprofits, the work of community work, the work of often a lot of our programs, and the work that our core members are doing are really in the front lines of addressing these issues, but understanding that service is not about reframing service to looking at how is it actually can be shifted to drive towards dismantling the systems that keep the fences there, that keep the resources distributed the way they're distributed, so that the person who can see over the quote unquote fence anyway, the fence isn't even the barrier, it still ends up accruing more resources, right? So thinking about one of the things that we challenge ourselves in, particularly within a service framework, is undoing that missionary, the culture of the missionary, that we're coming into a community to save a community, that we're coming into community to fix a community, that we have something to give, provide. Those sorts of words reaffirm they're oppressive, and they also reaffirm inequity. They reaffirm the differences in power, and really sort of how do we shift ourselves organizationally and personally and with our core members and the communities that we're located in, from a missionary sort of framework to one where the folks in the community are helping to shape the work, helping to drive the work, create the work, participate in the work, and have access to the work. And how are we doing that in very strategic and deep ways? And that's not something that's done overnight, but that is something that we have to constantly be driving ourselves to do and to continue to grow in.
Great. Okay. So a couple questions in the chat box about how to remove the boxes. And I think at this point, important to understand the boxes themselves, or the mental model that has produced all of this as a framework. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time on the cycle of socialization. So spending a little more time on why things are the way they are. So we're all born into a cycle of oppression and socialization. And you know, the easiest way for me to talk about the cycle is to explain it, I guess, through my perspective and the way that I've experienced it. So I was born into this world many moons ago as a white female, and there were things that were already set in place, right? So from a socialization standpoint, you know, there were definitely expectation, history, stereotypes and myths that my parents gave to me. And it's interesting because even though my parents were actively participating in the civil rights movement, it was limited. And their understanding, their mental model was, we are good people, therefore we are not racist, right? So they raised me with that story, that bad people are the ones who are racist, good people aren't racist, therefore we're good people. Aaron, if you're a good person, you're not going to be racist, right? So that was sort of the mental model that I was raised with. Also, even though my parents talked about not being racist, their social system, their friends, etc., who, you know, the family homes that we went over to when I was younger, they were all white. So, right, so there's the story being told to me about race, but then there's what I'm seeing when I'm young. From an institutional standpoint, I grew up in a suburb that was almost entirely white. Didn't even realize it. Didn't even realize the context that I was living in. I went to a high school that was white. The media that I consumed was all about centering white women with a certain body type, with, you know, certain hair, with certain faces. And so it's like in high school that I think I begin this real, like, to have this sort of intersectional viewpoint about, like, I know I'm not racist, I'm a good person, but then I'm trying to figure out who I am as a woman and a white woman. And that's when I really begin to see myself from the outside in, right? Like, I develop an idea of myself and my body that's seeing me from the outside in. You know, over time, the way that I internalized and enforced the ideas, really, for me personally, really began to have a negative impact on me. And I think it was because I wasn't connected to my true self. There was a way that I was experiencing the world that didn't have voice, that wasn't validated. And so instead, I really focused on what I could do to perform within the system that was laid out for me. So it was easy for me to get A's. So I got straight A's. It was easy for me to do certain things to my own body that were harmful. like not eat as much as I should be eating. And so I really developed a mental model that was harmful toward myself, but that was reinforced going up to the upper left-hand part, like was reinforced in positive ways. Like the skinnier I got, the more like the boys in my high school liked me, the more I didn't really focus on my own learning or my own voice, but really just focus on getting A's, the more everyone was like, oh, you know, she's great, she's got herself together, right? And so this is just a really small, like minor way to kind of talk about how socialization acted on me. And it really wasn't until I got to college that I had sort of an interrupting moment, which we're going to talk about later, which sort of jolted me out of the mental model that I had and let me know that, you know, it wasn't like what I was experiencing wasn't quote unquote normal. It wasn't quote unquote right in any way. It was a construct. And, you know, and at the core of this cycle is really fear. At least that's how I think about it, you know, and it's like the fear of being left out, the fear of not having enough, you know, the idea that scarcity is with us and we all have to compete for money and food and shelter and good jobs and grant dollars and all of that, right? So the core of the system and what keeps it moving is confusion, hurt, anger, and ultimately fear. So that's the socialization cycle. And as that's working, right, on an individual level, there's also an iceberg that is with us and manifesting in different ways, right? And so when we think about the iceberg, you know, again, I sort of think about the cycle of socialization sort of acting and moving throughout the iceberg. You know, and so thinking about the cycle that I just talked through, what would be peaking out of the iceberg would be like, oh, Erin is doing great, she's getting straight A's, and under the iceberg are all these other things happening. What also can be peeking out of the iceberg are things that are happening on an organizational level, right? So taking an example that I hear many program folks talk about is to say, well, our programs, our members are really comprised of white people, comprised of white women, and that's just the way it is, right? We really want to change it, but it's that's just coming to us. And so if we look at that event happening, if that's the event that's peaking out, the patterns underneath it might be the way people are recruited, right? One of the things we know is that white folks tend to have white networks and they hire from those networks. And white folks tend to be more comfortable hiring other white people. And so the pattern of behavior underneath the idea that all of our members are white can be, you know, that there are white networks. Under that, we have organizational structures. So it could be that the hiring manager and the hiring manager's boss are white and have the white networks. The partnership structure that the organization has is really, it's based on, we could say, white folks having coffee and building partnerships and getting to know other people who are white. There's also, from an organizational structure standpoint, the pressure to fill slots, right? We all feel that pressure around the next program year is coming. We need to get the slots filled. And also, one thing from an organizational structure is many AmeriCorps programs operate on an academic calendar, right? And so there's this idea that, you know, it is college people or folks who have just graduated from college who are looking for work or service at a particular time in the year. So underneath all that can be the beliefs and values, right? Beliefs and values in this case can be service is about giving, kind of going back to the mental or the values that Ava was just mentioning. Service is giving, service is about filling a need. And I think there also can be the belief that we don't have time to do things differently because, again, we're trying to fill the slots. The next program year is coming. We don't have time to do things differently. We don't know how to do it differently. And finally, at the bottom of the iceberg is the mental model. And in this case, might be something like we're good people doing good work. Our intentions are good. People who are in poverty or who are oppressed don't want to do this kind of work. And also going back to the cycle I just mentioned, there's this idea about fear, right? Fear, anxiety. There are many technical systems and structures we have to operate when we get a grant. There's power dynamics. We want to be good stewards. This is just not possible for us to really work on this. Okay, I'm going to pause there because that was a lot. So thinking both about the cycle of oppression and socialization and the iceberg. Want to invite all of you to think about, is there something that's happening either for yourself or in the organization or program that you're working in that needs further exploring? Is there something that's sticking out to you that might have something underneath the surface? Is there anything happening from an equity standpoint that you might look at and say, I wonder, I see this happening. Maybe there's something else going on, something underneath the surface that could be explored. So take a minute to do that. If you would like to put your reflections in chat, that would be wonderful. I'm also going to pause and see if Ava has anything to add.
I don't.
Okay, awesome. Also, if anyone wants to raise their hand and share with voice, that would be great.
I know in reading the chats,
okay.
A couple of folks have stated they wanted some applicability to, what's going on in their AmeriCorps program, and I think this is a really good place to start, as is the understanding the iceberg. And so it really is looking at what's happening at your organization, what's the event, what's the thing that the recruitment need, and then analyzing what's the patterns of behavior, the organizational structures that underlie that, the beliefs and values, and then the mental models and paradigms that operate. So thinking about that in terms of what folks are wanting to unpack and understand in terms of opportunities for shifting that within their organizations. This is a good place to apply that.
Erin, I see Sherry Paul has her hand raised. So Sherry, I think your line is unmuted now.
I agree with, this is very eye-opening. One area that I have struggled with too is reaching out to alternative locations for recruitment. In the past, I'm new to this position, but in the past, it's been universities or really the lack of recruitment outside of the usual places. And so the other issue too I have here is the stipend is really challenging for everyone. But just looking at alternatives for recruitment would be helpful if anybody has suggestions.
Thank you, Sherry. That's great. And so thinking about the iceberg, I think you pointed out something really great. Like, we recruit from certain places because that's what we've always done, right? Those are the partnerships we have set up. Those are the places that we always go to. And also you mentioned stipend and somebody else mentioned stipend too. And I agree wholeheartedly. There's a mental model, there's a belief system, and there's organizational structure around what the stipend is, why it is set where it is, and I think ultimately leads to national service being available and open only to certain people. And that's definitely a iceberg issue for us. Okay, so we have folks talking about host organizations wanting private college education, right? So students at those schools tend to be wealthy and white. Absolutely. So you have the mental models of the folks who work in the organizations who are hosting. The community we live in, working large, is largely white, so trying to find those alternative locations for recruiting is largely white. Recruitment again. Recruitment of more racially diverse audience, yet not enough support built in, therefore lower retention rates among people of color members. Okay. Okay. And one participant works in conservation, which is an area replete with history of exclusion and oppression. Okay, great. All right, so we're going to keep the iceberg and the cycle model, if we can hold that, as we move on to our next section to give us another diagram to hold.
Okay, so thinking about the cycle of socialization, the reality of what we're all kind of operating in individually and then also systemically, moving into the cycle of liberation. So this is really thinking about how do we understand liberation as a cyclical process, just like we understand socialization. And so this is a person named Bobby Harrow, which actually a couple of our tools that we've used today is coming from a book called Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. It's what we use with our core members. It's what we use also within staff to help us understand some of these concepts. So if you're really interested in exploring more about these concepts for your program, I really suggest y'all check out Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. And this is where this cycle of liberation it comes from. A person named Bobby Harrow was looking at the things that seem to occur in successful social change efforts. So looking at this cycle as a cyclical process, so one can enter this cycle at any point through a slow evolution of experiences or thinking about experiences to a critical incident. So a critical incident is something that sort of happens and you sort of wake up and you kind of experience sort of cognitive dissonance. So this cycle of liberation repeats many times. And so there's no specific beginning or end point, just as the work is never done to end oppression. So we want to introduce this cycle of liberation as a framework from what we can build to what we can imagine as possible, and then also thinking about the center of the cycle, which is self-love, hope, self-esteem, balance, joy, support, security, spiritual space, authentic love. So thinking about how does your program, how do you have these things? How do your core members have these things through your program? How does the community have these things? And how can you build and continue to strengthen your program that at the core of it is about perpetuating and building self-love, hope, self-esteem, joy, support, security. Some of the chat comments have I think addressed sort of what the challenges are to that. And so thinking about the first of the cycle of liberation, which is waking up. So liberation begins when when a person begins to experience themselves differently in the work than they have in the past, it's marked by a change inside, sort of an interpersonal change. It's the change in the core of someone about what they believe about themselves. And this change could be because of a critical incident, like an incident that happened that kind of woke them up, or again, it could be something that's kind of been building over time. It's also one where we experience cognitive dissonance, where something that used to make sense to us, or we never questioned, ceases to make sense, and we begin to question it. The next part of this phase is getting ready. Sort of once we know something, we cannot not know it anymore. So this is about consciously dismantling and building aspects of ourselves and our worldviews based on new perspectives. This is about introspection, again, self-reflection, thinking inwardly. That's sort of the iceberg, kind of harkening back to the iceberg. It's about education, educating ourselves, and consciousness raising. It's about raising our awareness and our consciousness of what's going on, and it's about developing a sense of consistency between what we believe, how we want to live our lives, and the ways we actually do it. So seeing the connections among all aspects of our lives and moving towards integrity. So thinking about this work within AmeriCorps is also challenging us to think about how are we practicing this in our own lives, so that we're not compartmentalizing our work within our AmeriCorps program to just our work within AmeriCorps. Our programs are situated in community. We are a part of the communities as well. What makes and breaks all of this work is relationships. So thinking about our role personally, not just in an AmeriCorps context, but understanding that if we strengthen our own personal resolve in this and our own ability to do this, not just within an AmeriCorps context, it'll strengthen how we do this within an AmeriCorps context as well. So this is really building an analysis of oppression, and then also the getting ready phase is really looking at the skills and tools that we need to serve us towards moving towards liberation. The next part of this is reaching out. So this is where we seek experiences outside ourselves in order to check our reality. And we expose ourselves to a wider range of differences than we have before. So in thinking about folks that might be having recruitment challenges, encouraging, I just want to ask this question: have folks reached out to the communities that they want to engage to understand why they may not be engaged, or what they need to be engaged, or how it would look like for them to be engaged? So thinking about that. So we're not just, also how are we building relationships and reaching out to communities that is not just about boosting our numbers, right? We can increase our number of diverse people, but if they're walking into toxic situations, if they're walking into situations that are not, environments that are not designed for their success and for their support, we're actually creating more harm, right? And so that can happen on, there's multiple things that need to be happening. It's relationship building within the communities that we want to engage, but hearing from them what they want, what do things look like from them, understanding from their perspective. It's also working within our organizations and our host sites, and also within our community spaces, to begin to shift the conversation around the type of environments that exist, and how to change those environments. So you could boost your number of XYZ group identity, from a particular identity, and call that diversity, but it could actually be harmful if the context of where they're serving and how they're serving is harmful to them. So thinking about the reaching out piece to that. It's also about identifying when you're reaching out, you're using skills and tools, and you're expressing, you're taking a stand, right? You're expressing what needs to change. You're also, at this point, you may be getting pressure from folks to stop making waves or accept the status quo. But you also you know, in sort of consequences for reaching to folks is saying, okay, this is what the problem is, this is the issue, this is the inequity, this is how we're trying to build, to change it. You know, you're going to get pushback, but at the same time, you're going to identify new friends, you're going to identify allies in that. And so this really moves from the point of the waking up, which is the intrapersonal, so what's going on internally, and towards liberation to an interpersonal. So how are you working in community within others to move towards liberation? The next phase to that is the cycle of is building community in this cycle. So this is where the interpersonal change is. This is the change that is the liberation that you're moving towards in community with other people. This is really about changing how you value others and how we interact with folks on a regular basis. So, and this part of the cycle, this is where you're creating dialogue with people who may identify with and people who you don't identify with. So people who are like you, people who are not like you. This is where views are exchanged, where people are valued. And this involves a lot of come together and listening, particularly for those thinking about those who have power and those without power, and how we see each other. The next part of this is coalescing. So this is where you've reached out. You're in the process of building community with folks to towards liberation, towards addressing an issue. Then the next thing is you're minimizing those barriers. You've got a coalition happening. You're getting ready to move into action plan to interrupt an oppressive system or an oppressive event. You're organizing, you're planning actions, you're motivating others. You're also doing this in community, right? You're doing this with people. How you're moving through this is really informed by the collective, right? And y'all are coming together on that. And then the next piece to that is creating change. So using our, I think there might have been an error. If you could go to the next slide, just go. I think I duplicated it by accident. Is there one other slide? Can you go to the next slide, Erin?
No, no.
Oh, you know what? I must have.
Sorry.
Yeah. No worries. So instead of getting ready, it should be creating change. So this is about using the critical analysis and the power of the coalition to begin to transform the system. So this is about creating a new culture that reflects the collective identity. So this is where the new assumptions, new structures, new roles are consistent with a more socially just and equitable philosophy. So this is where you're forming partnerships that are across differences. You're taking leadership risks. You're sharing power. You're working to heal towards past differences. And the power that is being created is created through cooperation and from within. It's not top down. So in thinking about how do you expand, the question often is framed at how do we recruit more from? That's important, but I also think the question is not only how do you recruit from communities that are typically being served, it's like how organizationally does your program reflect the community that it's served, and not just in the sense of who the core members are, because there's a power imbalance, or there's a power differentiation between core members, staff members, state commission members. There's hierarchies that's the reality. So when we think about what it means to be inclusive, it's also like what is happening internally within our organizations that can support an inclusive cohort, an inclusive core, right? What's happening within our host sites? What's the diversity of our host sites, or what's the change that needs to happen in practices among our host sites or among our programs that create a space for every core member to thrive regardless of identity. So That's really the part of the creating change piece, right? And then maintaining. So anything that you created, or say the collective has created in addressing these issues, it's got to be like anything new, it has to be taken care of. It's got to be nurtured. So that means the change that was created or implemented has got to be strengthened. It's got to be monitored. It's got to be integrated into the daily practices. It needs to be evaluated, debugged, modified. It's an ongoing thing, right? And the cycle continues again. So it's not work that's done after you've maintained. This is very dynamic and adaptive work. It's responsive to the changes that are happening in the community. And at the core of this, this is the quality and states of being that hold this whole cycle of liberation together. And that is self-love, hope, self-esteem, balance, joy, support, security, spiritual base, authentic love, right? So how does this show up for you in your work? How does this show up for you within your organization, within your program? How does this show up for you within your core members? How does this show up in your communities, right? And how are you aligning your actions and your thoughts that move towards the liberation? And it's often not about going as big as possible. It's often about going as deep as possible, as opposed to wide as possible in terms of places to start, particularly the importance of relationship building. It really begins with the first phone call, the first meeting that you set up, to understand, to learn more, and to be ready to understand that the change that you want to see happen may not be what the community wants to see happen. So how do you build a program model or a program experience that reflects that? And how is that being integrated really from within the organization? Because we often want diversity in the core members, but we may not, or equity within that, but we may not have it internally within our organization. So, or even internally, personally, right? So it's really setting ourselves up for understanding that this is, this is long-term work. This is work where mistakes are going to be made. You're walking into situations where you or your program may have created harm, or someone in the past may have created harm. So trust has got to be built and rebuilt. And it is difficult work, but it is precisely the work. And this is where often coalitions can shut down, or the work can stop because it can get centered too much on one person, or coalitions or groups are struggling to move through the process of trust and rebuilding trust, and moving from making mistakes, and recognizing, from the onset that that's going to happen. But how do we build our resiliency in continuing to do this work? So this cycle presents it, I think it's a good tool for understanding the different strategies or different approaches of what you're moving towards in terms of liberation, but the work is not going to be in a bullet point sort of, then you do this, then you do this, then you do this, right? These things are going to be happening. The cycle, you could be actively moving in, thinking about liberation, at the same time unconsciously a part of social, socialization practices, right? So this is a work that is ongoing. So when we think about liberation, it is the practice of love. Liberation is the practice of love. It is about finding balance. It's about development of competence. So those are those skills, those tools. It's the belief that we can succeed. It is joy. It is the knowledge that we are not alone. So already I'm hearing a lot of programs just in the chat box talking about the opportunities for, right? So all of us are thinking about this work. The commitment, it is commitment, because this isn't going to happen in one grant cycle, right? This is going to be ongoing, and it is about remaining, I think, having passion towards this work and compassion in this work. So thinking, I think that's, so this thing that I talk about, we've used it with my allies, and I really like it. It's called In Lakesh. It is it's basically from a Mayan statement that says, I am you and you are me. And so thinking about, you are my other me. If I love and respect you, I love and respect myself. If I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. So thinking about our relationship to our communities as mutual, and as a reflection, how our community is reflecting us and how are we reflecting our communities.
Great, thanks, Ava. And so really wrapping up this section of what we're talking about today, we're really, I think, ultimately talking about the work of holding both the understanding of how we have been socialized and taught and taught to perceive ourselves and our power relative to others, and the core of fear and lack that drives that cycle. And then also at the same time, the cycle that Ava just talked about, the cycle of community building, true partnership, and the cycle for which self-love and joy are sitting at the center. And I think that, one of the things we want to emphasize is that is the work itself. It's holding both of those and building the awareness in ourselves and the capacity to hold those even more fully. In my experience, I only notice more about each cycle the more I do the work. And so it's about how can we build the capacity within our own systems, within our own bodies, to hold these cycles and make sense of it. And I think there's at least from my standpoint, there's a commitment I have to the love and the hope that's sitting at the center, and a commitment to going back to that as, when in doubt, when I don't know what to do, when it is unclear, right? I am going to choose to go back to and center myself within that. And I think that the focus, I think Ava has said this a couple times, but the focus on self-love, I think, is really key, particularly for those of us who hold more privilege within the system, these systems, because it can be really easy to fall down a trap of shame and loathing for ourselves. And the strength and commitment comes from finding the love to come back to the process and come back to the work, and not center it in ourselves as, this isn't about whether I have been racist or I will ever be racist or sexist again. This is about my commitment to understanding the cycles that are acting on me and the choice that I have. Okay. And then moving to action.
So this is thinking about this action continuum. So this is, whenever we look at activities that are either going to support oppression in its existence or are about confronting oppression and moving us towards liberation, it's a sort of a continuum or a spectrum. So on one side, we have actively participating in oppression, denying or ignoring oppression, recognizing no action, to moving towards actions that move us towards liberation. So that's recognizing, taking action, and starting with ourselves, right? That sphere of influence is educating ourselves, starting internally, educating others, or working in coalition, supporting and encouraging and initiating and preventing oppression. And so can you move to the next slide? So actions that support oppression. So that's actively participating. So that is thinking about, these are telling derogatory jokes, putting down people from targeted groups, intentionally avoiding targeted group members, discrimination, verbally or physically harassing targeted group members, right? Denying, which is enabling discrimination and injustice by denying that targeted group members are this does not actively discriminate or oppress, but you could deny that oppression exists, and then you could be colluding with oppression. So you're kind of ignoring it. Another one is you can be aware of oppression, of oppressive actions by yourself or others and their harmful effects, but you don't take any action to stop this behavior. This inaction could be a result, thinking about the socialization, right? It could be the result of fear or the lack of information, confusion about what to do. It can be about that discomfort that you feel between your awareness of the situation and the action that needs to happen and knowing what to do, but just stopping with stopping at that discomfort, right? Using that discomfort, using that confusion, using that not sure what to do as a place to kind of put it aside or bury it. And so when we think about oppression, we're thinking about what it means to recruit from our communities that are often experiencing oppression in multiple layers of it in intersecting ways, right? So it's understanding what folks might be learning from those folks, what they might be experiencing or perceiving or understanding in relationship to you or to your organization and their role within the community. So then moving towards actions that confront oppression. So that's recognizing, and that's action. So being aware of oppression and injustices, and then recognizes the oppressive actions of ourselves and others and takes action to stop them. So this is where I, believe we all are coming to this workshop at, right? And so the first part of that is educating self. So that's taking actions to learn more about oppression and privilege. What is the privileges that we hold in our role? What is the power that we hold? What are the ways that we are gatekeepers? Because we are all gatekeepers in our role within AmeriCorps. What about also it's about learning about the life experiences affected by injustice and relationships. So this could be reading, attending workshops, seminars, cultural events, participating in discussions, joining organizations or groups that oppose injustice, attending social action and change events. And in my experience, a lot of the deeper work around relationship building can happen when we're joining other folks who are working towards working towards change or social action. So that's a good way to continue to deepen relationships that will improve how your program is being is inclusive, is figuring out your own relationship and your organization's own relationship to folks in the community who are actively addressing these issues, and finding ways to connect with them. So that's educating others. So that's moving beyond just educating yourself to questions and dialogue with others too. That could be looking at your host sites, right? What is the climate at your host sites that and for staff at host sites that need to be, that's an opportunity for educating others, and where oppression can occur for our core members that may be keeping them from engaging in AmeriCorps. And then supporting and encouraging. So that's supporting others who speak out against injustices, or actively working to be more inclusive of targeted folks who are typically excluded, and backing up organizations and folks are becoming allied with organizations or coalitions that are doing this work. And then the other thing is initiating, preventing. So that's working to change individual and institutional actions and policies that discriminate. It could be planning educational programs, events, and being very clear and making sure that members of groups who are historically marginalized are able to be full participants in organizations and groups. And so thinking about that for your organization is, how do you define full participation for folks that in your communities within your program? Thinking about how you clearly articulating what full participation looks like, and then what are the things that are going to be needed within your organization, within your host sites, and within your community for that to happen. And that's at the core of this work. It is collective. It's to require everybody at the table, many people at the table, many hands doing this work.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So as we begin to wrap up our conversation, just in the last couple minutes we want to shift to action planning. So no easy answers in this session, but hopefully a lot of information for you to chew on and think through. And as you're doing that, we are curious, what's the next action you are committed to that moves just a little bit more towards inclusion? What moves either you or your work a little bit more toward liberation? So let's take a minute or so to think about it. And want to invite all of you to write your next action in the chat box. It should be something personal, something that you need to do to increase the understanding that you have. I'm going to go back to the action continuum. So thinking about the steps on the right-hand side of the continuum, educating self, educating others, supporting, encouraging, etc. What's your action commitment? All right. To plan ways to educate others and support local DEI-centered groups, supporting, encouraging. One of us wants to take the time to speak to other groups. That's great. That may not feel as included or have interest in our program because it's important to gain understanding both ways. Yes. All right. I think in this work, and Ava, if you want to say more about this, it's really important to have a component about action, especially for those of us who come from privilege, because there's, what we don't want to do is get caught in sort of the tendency to just improve ourselves and that's it, right? To just get our own mental model right and that's it. But part of the work is moving outside of our comfort zones and taking the next step or the next piece of action that moves you, that moves the work that you're doing. So please take a second to write in chat. It'll be great documentation for us as well. And it'll be good information for Ava and I as we work to finalize the next 2 sessions. So a little bit of a plug as we close about the next 2 sessions. We have 2 more scheduled. I think you all are already signed up for them. If you signed up for this one, they're the next 2 Tuesdays. They're going to build on the content we've gone over here. There'll be a little bit of review in the beginning, just a little bit around some of the language, so that we can include anyone who's new to the session. And then leaving with a final quote. Ava, do you want to take us through this?
Sure. This is a quote by Audre Lorde, and it says, "When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid." And this quote came to me when I was in a meeting, a board, and we were working on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there was such a, I was surprised, but there was such a visceral reaction to looking at the institutional practices of this organization. And I was feeling personal repercussions, like hostility, personal hostility from from board members, feeling there was like very personal feelings that I was experiencing in the effort to hold space for equity and inclusion. And I left that meeting feeling isolated and kind of alone. And I logged onto Facebook, and this was a quote that someone had shared in a different situation, but it spoke to me, and it just reminds us that in this work we're going to of changing the status quo of how our programs show up, the status quo of AmeriCorps, the status quo of what's happening in our communities, that there's a vulnerability, right? But we have to lean into the power of the collective and recognize to not let fear stop us, to accept that we might feel fear or have feelings that are less than positive, but power is really about understanding the collective power is really what will move us through this.
Awesome. So thank you to everyone. Thank you all for being present. Thank you for your participation in chat and voice. Thank you to Rachel and ASC again for supporting this work and partnering with us in it. We look forward to being with you next Tuesday. Have a great rest of your day and take care. Thank you so much.